All right, so here we go with Chapter 3, the significance of materials used in art. We're going to combine the portion of Chapter 2 that we skipped at that point, and we're going to pick that up along with the rest of Chapter 3. One of the things that contributes to the meaning of an artwork is the material the artwork's made of. The materials used in the creation of art might make an artwork more or less valuable. Additionally, the artist, the style, and the period are also things that can add to the value of the artwork. And we're going to be talking about standard medium and specialty mediums. This is always kind of a tricky point. When we say media, that is what we use to make our art, but media is singular. So if you're using one thing, pencil, to do your artwork, you're using pencil as the media. If you're talking about more than one, then it becomes the term medium. So here's where we go back and pick up the materials and the mediums from Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we discussed 2D, 3D, and 4D art. Now we're going to concentrate, though, on two-dimensional art. And 2D art can be drawing or painting or printmaking. Drawing is usually, but not always, done in a monochromatic medium. Monochromatic, mono means one, chroma means color. So monochromatic color scheme is a one color scheme. Monochromatic mediums can be charcoal, Conté crayon, metal point, or graphite. But then we have the multiple colors: crayon, color pencils, ink, pastels. Now here, if you're thinking briquettes like you use in a barbecue grill, you're not far off. Charcoal is made from wood that's been burned until it's a powder. Now, the black color of the charcoal comes from a lack of oxygen in the burning process. If oxygen is present, then the ash would be more of a gray color. This powder is then combined with a binder, which is either a resin or a glue, and then it's compressed into blocks or sticks. Charcoal makes very dark marks, it's difficult to erase, and it's a little messy. Now, willow or vine charcoal is simply burned twigs. They're not completely burned down to ash. And this charcoal leaves a lighter line, and it's good for preliminary sketching. It can be erased. Charcoal's also available in pencil form in a varying degrees of hardness. And since charcoal does smudge so easily, drawings should be sprayed with a fixative when you're finished with them. Conté is similar to charcoal, except the binder is a wax or a clay. And typically this comes in earthy colors. It isn't quite as messy, but it does tend to blend like charcoal does. Metal point uses a soft metal like silver, gold, or pewter, and it's put into a holder, and then it is drawn on a rough paper. So little pieces of the gold and silver or the pewter then flake off onto the paper. We all know about graphite pencils, and graphite drawing pencils come in a variety of hardnesses, as you can see by the chart on the left. Most people who draw professionally will have a variety of these hardnesses because they're good for different kinds of things. But if you don't have that wide variety, or when in doubt, stick to the 2B pencil. That's what we've used in school, those nice yellow pencils. That's what a 2B pencil is. And when in doubt, 2B will work. Now, pastels are similar to compressed charcoal, except that a colored pigment is used. Again, it is kind of messy, so when you work with pastels, you would want to use some sort of a spray fixative. Oil pastels are kind of a fun media to use. The oil pastel, they're basically semi-solid sticks of oil paint. They can be blended, they can be mixed. You can do a lot of really cool things with them, but they can also be kind of messy. Ink is a combination of a pigment and a binder that is suspended in a liquid. Ink can be used with a pen, as in the drawing of the eye, or it can be diluted and brushed on with a brush to create an oriental look. They call it sumi-e brush painting. Who doesn't love crayons? Crayons are a colored pigment that is mixed with a waxy binder. A lot of times you can use crayon with a water-based medium, or if you remember back when you used to dye Easter eggs, you could write on the Easter egg with a crayon and the dye wouldn't stick to that. So you can also use it with watercolor and things like that. Colored pencil is another favorite of mine. You have the colored pigment mixed with the binder and put into stick form. There is such a variety of colored pencil shades that you can get some really unique and really interesting colors going. Now we're going to talk about painting. Probably the most common paint used today in the classroom especially is acrylic paint. Acrylic paint has a water-soluble polymer as a binder. It dries quickly, can be rinsed out of brushes with water, so it's easy cleanup. It's an opaque medium, means that you can't see through it. So if you ever boo-boo with acrylic paint, you can just let it dry and paint over it. Oil paint is a medium that uses an oil like linseed oil as the binder for the colored pigment. Oil is typically favored because it has a long drying time, so the artist has time to manipulate it a little bit more. The downside to it is it has a longer drying time. Oil paints are also harder to clean up. You actually have to use turpentine to clean it. And oil paints are unique in that they can either be opaque, in other words, you can't see through them, or they can be transparent, where you can see through them, just depending on how they're applied. Watercolor, that's my personal fave when it comes to painting, uses water-soluble Arabic as the binder. Paints are mixed with the water, and the key is water, and applied to an absorbent material like paper or sometimes fabric. As the water dries, then the pigment is deposited onto the paper. Because you use the water, you can manipulate watercolor in some very interesting ways that you can't manipulate other kinds of paint. Encaustic painting is where you use melted beeswax as a binder. So you mix your pigment into the melted beeswax. It has to be applied to a rigid surface because of the weight of the wax, and it also gives some really interesting textures to paintings. Fresco painting, there are actually two different kinds. One kind of fresco painting is painting on a dry wall. So it's very similar to what we would do if we were painting a mural today. The true fresco, though, is mixing the paint pigment in with wet plaster. And as that dries, then the painting actually becomes part of the wall. You have to work it in small sections because you have to work it before the plaster dries, but you can kind of see in the illustration on the left how that might work out. Tempera paint is probably the oldest type of paint, and probably nowadays it's also the cheapest kind of paint, and it's used in schools a lot with elementary level students. But original tempera paint used egg yolk as a binder, which was kind of difficult to work with because the egg yolk dried very quickly. Printmaking is another type of two-dimensional art. The nice part about printmaking is that it actually lets you create multiple images or multiple copies of the same image. Now, relief printing is, I don't know if you've ever made a potato print or you use those cute little stamps, you know, the smiley face stamps and an ink pad. But a relief print is made by removing the surface of a matrix. That's whatever your printing plate is going to be. Usually it's linoleum or perhaps it's wood. And you leave the area that's going to print. And then that's covered with ink and pressed onto a surface. Relief printing is a reverse process. So you can see with the image on the far left, reversed image, the part that's been carved out of the linoleum plate is part that doesn't print. Now, your handprint and your footprint are probably the first relief prints you ever made. And that's because of the texture of your hand. You don't get a real flat look. You can see all the little creases and things like that. Intaglio takes a metal plate of some sort and scratches the design into the surface. You can kind of see that on the left-hand side. Then ink, a really stiff ink, is applied to where it goes into those scratches. And then you put your paper onto it, you roll it through a printing press, and that forces the paper into those scratch marks to pick up the ink. A lot of money these days is made with intaglio printing. Lithography uses a specially treated stone and grease pencils. And the whole idea with lithography is the basic theory that oil and water don't mix. Stencils come in many different forms, from the stencils that you might use to paint different kinds of designs on your walls, to screen printed stencils and images. A lot of times t-shirts, those kinds of images are created with a screen printing technique. Now we're going to start getting into our Chapter 3 stuff. And Chapter 3 is about the utility and the value of materials. And some of the earliest art, we know that it was made with whatever they had on hand. They experimented with media and techniques, and pottery is one of the oldest known utilitarian objects that we have available to see. A lot of the other types of utilitarian objects in ancient times were made of organic materials, so they decomposed. But they have found pottery shards that they have dated as 20,000 years old in areas of China. And here are some images of some of those pottery shards. Shards would be just like a little portion or a little piece of it. If you dropped a flower pot, those would become pottery shards. Now, gradually, hand-built pottery became more sophisticated. First by simple designs that were scratched into the surfaces, maybe a little lip on the pot that made it easier to pick up. The conical nature of the pots that are on the left-hand side probably made it a lot easier to sit that in the fire and use it as a cooking pot of some sort. Later, the potter's wheel made pottery even more sophisticated, and it's used today even. The potter's wheel allowed artisans to make vessels that had thinner walls, and they could create more variations in the shapes of the of the pots that they threw. Some of the most sophisticated pottery comes from the Ming Dynasty, from China in the 14th to the 17th centuries. So as time went on, pottery became more sophisticated, design works became more detailed, new shapes of pottery vessels were created, and new kinds of clay were developed. Here we're looking at some ancient pottery out of China from the Han Dynasty, and you can see the variations in the shapes and even a little bit of variation in the colors that are going on there. Now, knowing that various clays yielded various results, in the 14th century, potters in China discovered that they could change the way clay looked and fired by adding kaolin and pituince. New ways of decorating the clay vessels also developed over time. Anything from storytelling, as in Egyptian pottery, to some of the most intricately detailed vessels that come from the Ming Dynasty. That clay that they mixed with kaolin and pituince created the kind of clay that we now call porcelain. It was a very sturdy clay. You could make very thin walls. When it was dried and fired, it was a little bit translucent. You could see through it. Now, many times pieces of pottery are highly valued because the maker or the manufacturer. Many times a piece of art is associated with status. In other words, it's only for the rich and the titled. The urge to make art was so strong that even books and manuscripts were decorated with drawings and paintings, and those were called illuminations. If an object was being created for religious or royal purposes, the materials became even more lavish and sometimes even rare. Luxurious fabrics, rare stones, gold, silver were all used to create one-of-a-kind pieces that would reflect the status of the owner. The Book of Kells is a great example of an early illumination. It's an insular-style manuscript. It is of the four Gospels of the New Testament, created in a monastery in the British Isles in the 9th century AD. And you can see just the plates that have just images, gold leaf, very colorful, very intricately designed. Even the pages that were just text had very intricately designed letters that went along with that. Architecture also became really extravagant. Where there was money, you find impressive buildings, such as the churches and the cathedrals of the Roman Catholic Church. Panels of filigree, enamel, any kind of embellishment of those kinds is valued as gold and silver. Now, sometimes an architectural element was made of such prized materials, they were taken apart and reused in newer creations. The reused elements are called spolia, and it was especially common in religious art and art that commemorated notable rulers. A new ruler would come in, and in an effort to sort of erase the previous ruler, they would dismantle the kinds of monuments or buildings that they had, and then would reuse the pieces. Many times, those kinds of artifacts were seen as very extreme, considering the worth of the materials that were used in them. And sometimes, in times of need, like in war or famine, some pieces might have been taken apart and the precious materials would be sold as a way to feed or protect a community. On the left here, you can see the Arch of Constantine, which was in Rome, and it was commissioned by the Roman Council to commemorate Constantine's battles. And you can see some of the very intricate carving details. And then on the right-hand side, This was it was a bathhouse in Rome. Now it has been turned into a basilica or a church. And you can see that the columns are a different material than some of the other parts. So we're mixing hard materials. Wood was another material that was valued for monetary and cultural values. Some woods are rarer than others. Some are associated with specific areas, which makes them rare in some cases. In Northern Europe, from about 1000 to 1500 AD, artists favored linden wood or lime wood because it had a very fine wood grain and it allowed a lot greater detail. Sometimes those sculptures were then painted to make the sculpture look more lifelike. Furniture makers, a lot of times, are also known for specific types of woods and even specific decorative additions. Mahogany was a wood that was widely used in the 1700s. When you start talking about mid-century arts and crafts movement, oak became the wood of preference. Now, marquetry and inlay are two decorative elements that were often incorporated into the furniture. So here we see a couple of wooden altarpieces or wooden statues that were done, and then they're polychromed or painted in multiple colors. These are very intricate. They are very detailed, and they really are worth as much as some of the marble sculptures. The lacquer is another material that isn't so much costly material-wise, but it is very time-intensive. The lacquer is a wooden base with multiple layers of a tree resin. So it's put on in layers and it's dried. And many times 20, 30 layers of this resin are built up. Then they could be carved out just like you would carve out wood or something like that. Now the box on the right is carved and inlaid. So inlay, marquetry are ways of using other materials to set into. So all of these, the little gold pieces, the mother of pearl pieces, those are all cut and then laid into the indentations that were made by the carving so that it creates a smooth surface. Probably the most known materials of value would be your metals. Pure metals, gold, silver, copper, iron, they were pretty much used and traded as is. Alloys became popular later on, and they were thought to be much stronger. So you have bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, and you have brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc. We already talked in a former chapter about the lost wax casting process, which was a process that was primarily done with metals. So on the left-hand side, you see a bronze statue of Perseus with the head of Medusa. Now, because these materials had copper in them, copper has a tendency to, well, it doesn't have a tendency, it does age to that green kind of patina. And so many times bronze or brass statues would end up having that green kind of color. But when they're cleaned up, it's a nice little brownish color. Bronze is browner than brass is. We all know about metal being very valuable for jewelry making. So we've got on the left-hand side, we have a golden carnelian bracelet or necklace, and a solid gold snake bracelet. Those are both Roman in origin. Then we have a Germanic brooch, which is a pin. And if you can look real close, you can see that there are precious stones set into that brooch. That would have been an early 5th century way that they would have held cloaked together or some sort of a cape. So it was decorative, but it was also utilitarian at the same time. Now on the far right, in the British Isles, a real huge collection of gold jewelry that came from basically from invaders from the mainland was found at a place called Sutton Hoo. And this is a shoulder clasp, again, something that was kind of like something that would hold pieces of fabric together. This one, however, is cloisonne, which is a method of enameling metal. So you have the gold and then the colored parts, rather than being precious stones, are a kind of enamel work painted in there. Some very rare materials aren't used anymore, either because of an ecological or an economic reason. The most common one there is ivory. The ivory trade pretty much, it led to the near extinction of elephants. And so now they have manufactured ivory that they can use. And most real ivory artifacts, even if they're ancient artifacts, are boycotted. They try not to let those things get traded. So here we have two kinds of art that was done with ivory. We have the carved ivory. Here we have a box and we have a throne that are both done in ivory. These would have been done in smaller pieces, smaller panels, and then put together. And then scrimshaw is more, rather than carving into the surface, it's almost like writing into it or tattooing, if you will. And this scrimshaw cribbage board was done on a walrus tusk. And then you have materials that, by the nature of the owner of it, makes those materials much more valuable. So on the left-hand side, you can see some of the crown jewels from the United Kingdom. We have Sir Edward's crown, the orb, the scepters, the ring. Those are all accoutrements of a ruler when they're being coronated. And so only the finest jewels, only the finest gold would be used for something like that. On the right-hand side, we have a Far Eastern example of a Chinese summer court robe. So here we're using the finest kinds of fabric. We're using gold threads to decorate it. So this was this was created probably in the 1890s. So that's kind of an overview of Chapter 3. It is an overview. It does not have everything in there to really get the entire picture of how different materials can increase or decrease the value of a piece of artwork. You need to read. And here are some of the terms, only some of them, because there are a lot more terms in there to take a look at. So this finishes Chapter 3, talking about materials and the way they are valuable in artworks.